We'll call the hearing to order here and ask all the members to take their seats. This is on U.S. cyber diplomacy. And if we could just begin with kind of an overview, cyber attacks and commercial espionage and ransomware used by foreign governments, used by terrorists, used by criminals are a serious threat to our U.S. national security. They're also a threat to our economic interests around the globe, of course. As the intelligence community made clear in its assessment, the 2017 Worldwide Threat Assessment, and I'll quote from that, "Our adversaries are becoming more adept at using cyberspace to threaten our interests and advance their own, and despite improving our cyber defenses, nearly all information, communication networks, and systems will be at risk for years." Cyber threats have, of course, real-world impact, and in 2015, Chinese hackers stole the personnel files of 20 million current and former federal employees in a massive data breach. And last year, North Korean hackers crippled hospitals in the United Kingdom, and they also halted international shipping in India. Russia exploits cyberspace to attack its neighbors, including Estonia and Ukraine, and to attempt to undermine Western democracies, including the United States. Yes, our military does have some very unique offensive and defensive capabilities in cyberspace and other agencies to protect our critical infrastructure have as well. But it's our diplomats who work with our allies and partners to develop a common response to these threats. And they do that while engaging our adversaries to make clear that cyber attacks resulting in real-world consequences will be viewed by us as a use of force. The importance of the State Department's work cannot be understated. Indeed, the Department's role becomes essential when you consider that it's not just computer networks and infrastructure that the United States needs to protect. The open nature of the Internet is increasingly under assault by authoritarian regimes, regimes like China, that aggressively promote a vision of cyber sovereignty. And this vision emphasizes state control over cyberspace. This obviously could lead to a totalitarian dystopia. It obviously runs counter to American values of individual and economic liberty, and we know what that could mean, for example, to the people of China or other countries. We saw this recently in Iran. We saw the regime shut down mobile Internet access and saw them block and pressure companies to cut off social media tools that were used by the people of Iran to organize themselves and to publicize protests among the people of Iran. Authoritarian regimes would love to globalize this censorship, and that's the goal here, to globalize censorship. That's the kind of censorship they have long imposed at home, and they would like to entice and empower authoritarian regimes around the world to do the same thing. So it falls to our diplomats to help ensure the world rejects this limited version of cyberspace and that the American vision of an open, secure, innovative Internet wins out over George Orwell's premonitions. Coordination among allies is critical. In response to different undertakings of privacy between and understandings between the United States and Europe, the State Department worked with the Department of Commerce to successfully negotiate the EU-US Privacy Shield framework. And this ensures that data and business continues to flow across the Atlantic. And just yesterday, this House passed a bill strengthening our cyber coordination with Ukraine. But there's much more to be done. And that's why last month the House passed the Cyber Diplomacy Act. This bill, which I introduced, ensures that the State Department has a senior diplomat charged with leading this effort that brings together our security, human rights, and economic priorities. And I am encouraged to hear that the administration has heard our concerns and is working to elevate this position. So today we're joined by three experts with experience in cyber diplomacy, technology, and defense, including the Department's former coordinator for cyber issues. We look forward to discussing how Congress can best support strong cyber diplomacy. And with that, I turn to our ranking member, Mr. Engel, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing, and to our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on how the United States should improve its cybersecurity policy and address the cyber threats we face from overseas. America's adversaries are becoming bolder and more sophisticated as they pursue their aims in cyberspace. This is a challenge for our technology community, a new frontier for our diplomats, and a threat to our security. It's also an economic hazard, with American businesses standing to lose out in the face of hostile and unscrupulous behavior in cyberspace. Iran's attacks on America's infrastructure, including a dam near my district in New York, and North Korea's attack on the entertainment sector underscored troubling vulnerabilities to this sort of tactic. We reached a 2015 agreement with China to prevent cyber theft of intellectual property, but Beijing still exerts more and more state control over the Internet, denying its citizens basic freedoms and hurting American business. The United States is not working closely enough with like-minded governments to deter adversaries from stealing secrets or undermining an open and interoperable Internet. And of course, Russia's cyber attacks were the centerpiece of its attack on American democracy during the 2016 presidential election. On this last point, frankly, I'm stunned by the administration's utter failure to respond to these attacks. More than a year has gone by since the intelligence community revealed the extent of Russian meddling. Congress overwhelmingly passed new sanctions, new legislation to give the White House tools to punish those responsible. The law singles out those responsible for cyber crimes. It goes after the military and intelligence sectors that drove this attack. Yet the Trump administration has not imposed a single sanction related to election interference mandated by the law. The decision to completely ignore Congress's intent and blow off last week's deadline for new sanctions is made that much worse by what administration officials themselves admit, and that is Russia is at it again. The CIA director, a former member of Congress, a former colleague, Mike Pompeo, has said so repeatedly, which calls into question the State Department's claim that just the threat of sanctions alone will deter bad behavior. I'm at a loss. We're talking about the bedrock of American democracy, and the administration seems intent on signaling to Russia and the rest of the world that it's open season. Between the President's constant denial of Russia's involvement and his constant attacks on our own justice system, you would almost conclude that he would be fine with a repeat of what we saw in 2016. Well, I'm not fine with it. If the President won't take steps to protect American democracy, it falls to us as lawmakers. Last year, I introduced a bill with Mr. Connolly, the Secure Our Democracy Act, which would specifically go after those who interfere with an American election from overseas. When we passed the sanctions package last summer, we put this bill aside because we thought the President would use the tools we gave him to push back against Russian aggression. He didn't, so now I think it's time to reconsider this measure or something similar. Responding to Russia is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to our cyber policy. I also think we need to reverse course on the administration's relentless assault on our diplomacy and development. Mr. Painter, I'm sorry that you were one casualty of the administration's attempt to hollow out the State Department when you were forced out of your role as coordinator for cyber issues. This was a major blow to American leadership at a time when your expertise was needed the most. I was speaking with Mr. Keating just before, and we were lamenting about the fact about how the administration has really not sent us the witnesses that we really feel that we could use so they could give us the perspective from the executive branch. So I was glad to join Chairman Royce to introduce the Cyber Diplomacy Act, which would reinstate and elevate the position, your position, Mr. Painter. It passed the House a few weeks ago, and I hope the Senate acts on it soon. And I hope it sends a message to the administration that we need to ramp up our diplomacy on cyber, not scale it back. We need to engage with friendly governments facing the same threats. We need to push back against countries that will exploit these tools to pilfer our intellectual property, to hack into our country's most sensitive information, and to derail international norms to keep the Internet open and accessible. So I hope that our witnesses can shed additional light on these concerns and share with this committee their views on how the United States can lead on this issue. So I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. So this morning we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel, including Mr. Chris Painter. As you mentioned, he served as the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace and previously was the first coordinator for cyber issues at the State Department. We also have John Miller, Vice President for Global Policy and Law, Cybersecurity and Privacy at the Information Technology Industry Council. And we have Dr. Michael Solmeyer, Belfer Center's Cybersecurity Project Director at the Harvard Kennedy School. Previously, he served as the Director for Plans and Operations for Cyber Policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be made part of the record, and all the members here, you're going to have 5 calendar days to submit any other statements or questions or extraneous material that you want in the record. We've been informed that votes may come earlier this morning than we anticipated, so we want as many members as possible to have a chance to ask their questions. And to that end, members and witnesses, please respect the 5-minute time limit. So if you would, Mr. Painter, if you could summarize your remarks, we'll begin with you.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, it is a pleasure to be here today to discuss the growing technical and policy threats in cyberspace and the vital role of diplomacy in combating those threats and shaping an international environment that promotes an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable information infrastructure. For over 26 years, I have devoted my life to these issues, serving in senior roles in the Department of Justice, the National Security Council, and most recently as the first coordinator for cyber issues at the State Department. I continue to work on these issues after leaving government, including serving as a commissioner on the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace and a board member for the Center for Internet Security. Over the course of my career, I have seen the technical threats in cyberspace posed by state and non-state actors dramatically increase in both sophistication and number, and have seen the potential and actual impact of those threats grow exponentially. I've also seen the rise of serious policy threats to the very nature, structure, and governance of the Internet as we know it. Unprecedented attempts to undermine democratic processes, threats posed to economic prosperity, and the increasing drive by repressive regimes to suppress and control online discourse and undermine Internet freedom. It is clear that responding to cyber threats and seizing the many opportunities in cyberspace requires a whole-of-government response, leveraging the capabilities of agencies across the federal government and working with the private sector and civil society. It is also clear, given the international nature of the threats and the technology itself, that the State Department must play a leading role in that effort, and that effective cyber diplomacy is paramount. The United States has provided significant leadership in this area in the past. Indeed, my former office, the Office of the Coordinator for Cyber Issues, the first of its kind anywhere in the world, literally created and advanced a whole new area of foreign policy focus that simply did not exist before, and made substantial progress on a number of policy and operational fronts. Over 25 countries have followed our example by establishing high-level positions in their foreign ministries. For the U.S. to continue to lead, as it must, cyber issues must be reprioritized and appropriately resourced at the State Department. Among other things, effective cyber diplomacy involves, 1, building strategic partnerships with other countries around the world and engaging the many multilateral forums that are shaping cyber policy, 2, using diplomacy and diplomatic tools to directly respond to cyber threats, and 3, working with other agencies to facilitate law enforcement and technical cooperation and provide capacity building so other countries can better work with us. On a policy level, one of the most important issues is avoiding cyber conflict by building a global consensus on a framework for long-term cyber stability. My former office spearheaded this framework, comprised of the application of international law to cyberspace, acceptance of voluntary norms of state behavior, and implementation of confidence-building measures. It also includes working with the private sector and civil society on these issues. For example, the Global Commission that I serve on recently proposed a new multi-stakeholder developed norm entitled A Call to Protect the Public Core of the Internet. U.S. work on stability is also the foundation of using diplomatic and other tools and partnerships to better deter bad actors. Norms of behavior are irrelevant if there are no consequences for those who violate those norms. For example, the lack of a sufficiently strong, timely, and continuing response to Russian interference with our electoral process virtually guarantees that they will attempt to interfere again, both in the U.S. and other democracies around the world. We must do better. And finally, cyber diplomacy involves promoting core values such as internet freedom and fair market access. My former office made a great deal of progress on all of these issues, but a tremendous amount of work lies ahead, and sustained high-level diplomatic leadership is required. I was therefore disappointed that the State Department, even if temporarily, chose to downgrade my former office and constrict its resources. This sends the wrong message to our adversaries and allies alike. For the U.S. to lead and continue to make significant progress in cyber diplomacy, organizational structure and resources are important. Accordingly, I am pleased that this committee proposed and the House of Representatives passed the Bipartisan Cyber Diplomacy Act of 2017. Over my career, I have found that these issues have almost always been treated in a bipartisan manner, and I'm very happy to see that reflected in this important legislation. The Cyber Diplomacy Act appropriately makes clear that international cyber issues are a national policy priority. It calls out the importance of norms and stability, and importantly, the Act sets out a strong and appropriate organizational structure for the issues of the State Department by creating a statutory Office of Cyber Issues with a broad scope of cross-cutting substantive responsibilities at a high level and reporting through a neutral cross-cutting reporting chain that can give full voice to the important security issues as well as human rights and economic ones. Of course, as I've noted, adequate resources are also important to the success of this mission, and I hope Congress will address this very important issue in the future. Although much has been achieved over the last few years in cyber diplomacy, there's a long road ahead. Much needs to be done to continue to advance stability, norms, bolster deterrence, respond to threats, build partnerships, uphold human rights online, and advance fair economic access and prosperity. So I thank you for your interest and support of diplomacy in cyberspace, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify today on these important and timely issues, and I look forward to your questions.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee, on behalf of the Information Technology Industry Council, or ITI, thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the importance of U.S. cyber diplomacy in a world of growing threats. ITI is a global policy and advocacy organization representing over 60 leading technology and innovation companies from all corners of the tech sector and beyond, all doing business globally. As we survey the global cyber policy landscape, we see a remarkable level of activity signifying both opportunity and risk. A central element of ITI's global advocacy efforts involves helping governments understand the critical importance of cross-border data flows to the tech sector and the global economy. Data is central to the cutting-edge technologies and innovations that continue to extend the benefits of the Internet, including cloud computing, the Internet of Things, big data analytics, and artificial intelligence. The ability to freely move data across borders is essential not only to every business that operates internationally, but also to our ability to do everything from securing global networks and the personal data of customers to conducting international trade. Unfortunately, policymakers globally are responding to the expanding sophistication and capabilities of cyber adversaries, as well as more frequent and severe cyber incidents, by building virtual cyber policy walls at their borders, proposing cyber laws and policies that threaten to impede cross-border data flows, create trade barriers for U.S. companies, and undermine the trust and interoperability necessary for the global digital economy to continue to thrive. The trends we are most concerned about fall into four categories. One, forced localization, which refers to a broad set of policies designed to compel companies to relocate all or part of their business operations within a country's borders, including storing or processing data on servers or data centers located in-country as a precondition for market access. Two, siloed or country-specific standards and regulations, such as privacy-based transfer restrictions or security-based testing requirements, which pose significant risks to interoperability and data flows. Three, efforts by policymakers to impose cybersecurity audit, assessment, and testing requirements on private entities, a potentially invasive practice that contemplates testing conducted by government auditors, often requiring access to companies' intellectual property. Four, application of legacy regulations to technology and services innovations. Two recent examples of this rising trend include subjecting U.S. online services to so-called over-the-top regulations and expanding use of export controls, most notably in the context of innovative cybersecurity technologies. It is also important to understand that our global cyber policy threats aren't isolated to a few countries, regions, or economies. They are everywhere. It has been well documented that some countries, such as China and Russia, are taking approaches that incorporate many of these troubling cyber policy trends. But it's also critical to understand that policymakers in major economies, including the European Union, India, Brazil, and many others, are pursuing similar policies. Now for the good news. On balance, recent cyber policy activity in the U.S. embraces an approach that furthers global data flows, interoperability, innovation, and trust, avoiding many of these policy pitfalls. The Cyber Diplomacy Act of 2017 recounts many of these cyber policy achievements, as did Mr. Painter, and to that list we would add the Cybersecurity Threat Information Sharing passed by Congress in 2016, as well as the Cybersecurity Framework, a voluntary risk management-based framework grounded in international standards and best practices. The Cyber Diplomacy Act will complement these efforts well and provides a great encapsulation of the types of international cyber policy approaches needed to support an open, interoperable, and secure Internet that promotes data flows, innovation, and economic prosperity. The bill provides a roadmap for how the U.S. government can translate this expression of policy into action, including by securing and implementing commitments based on accepted cyber policy norms, holding the counterparties to those agreements accountable for their implementation, and prioritizing and resourcing the State Department's cyber function to maximize success. To complement the Cyber Diplomacy Act's solid foundation, we offer 3 additional recommendations designed to help the U.S. government maintain its leadership position in cyberspace while avoiding the potential that China's cybersecurity law emerges as the dominant approach to cyber policy in the region or even globally. First, to counter the trend of various countries increasingly advocating for their own local standards, testing protocols, and certifications, the U.S. needs a proactive and adequately resourced national cyber standardization strategy. Second, promoting the cybersecurity framework approach internationally as a counterweight to the data-restrictive policy approaches gaining prominence globally can help the U.S. sustain its leadership position on cybersecurity policy around the world. And third, pursuing multilateral solutions in parallel with bilateral agreements can be an important force multiplier to drive scalable policy solutions across the digital economy. We look forward to the opportunity to continue to work with Congress and the administration on this important set of issues. Thank you again for the opportunity to share our perspective, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Dr. Solmeyer.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, it's an honor to be with you today to discuss U.S. cyber diplomacy. Thank you for your bipartisan approach to cybersecurity. I'll keep my remarks brief. 3 topics to focus on. The first, the international environment for cyber diplomacy. The second, the challenges of deterrence. And third, our elections. First, we need diplomacy in cyberspace now more than ever. Our adversaries continue to refine their capabilities to conduct a range of cyber operations against us. We have developed offensive cyber capabilities and hardened our defenses, yet hackers keep hacking our systems. Under Chris Painter's leadership, the State Department pursued international efforts to promote norms of responsible state behavior. This effort gained momentum, especially during the latter years of the Obama administration, as did efforts to negotiate bilateral arrangements like the U.S.-China agreement. The current administration has thus far pursued more bilateral arrangements like the one it announced with Israel last summer. Yet my impression is that most state behavior, not state rhetoric, reflects a perception in international capitals that the benefits of unrestrained hacking outweigh the costs. So for the time being, the United States will likely need to focus on discrete bilateral arrangements while protecting U.S. interests in existing international institutions. Having a dedicated office at the State Department is crucial to pursuing both objectives. But for diplomacy to be successful, the United States needs to empower its diplomats with as much leverage as possible. One approach to creating more leverage is to improve our ability to deter adversaries from hacking us. In an ideal world, it would be a tremendous help if these threats could be deterred by one common approach, but the reality is far more complicated. Not all hacks are the same, so we should not expect a one-size-fits-all model of deterrence to be successful. Attacks against critical infrastructure certainly warrant the threat of significant cost imposition. In some situations, however, deterrence in the criminal law context, which aims to minimize but not necessarily eliminate the incidence of the crime, seems more applicable, especially to run-of-the-mill hacking, than an analogy to nuclear weapons. I would not want to bet the cybersecurity of the United States on a policy of deterrence if I did not have to. Sometimes, like the prospect of defending against thousands of nuclear-tipped missiles, deterrence is the least bad option, but this is not the case in cyberspace. We have other options, and we should employ them alongside deterrence, but we must be realistic about just how much we can expect from deterrence. So what does this mean when it comes to dealing with Russia, which launched a cyber-enabled influence campaign against us in 2016? Deterring a repeat of this conduct must be a priority for the entire U.S. government, and indeed for all nations whose elections are susceptible to Russian interference. The need to impose cost is clear, but the challenge is to impose it in ways that matter to the Russian regime, not in ways that are projections of what would matter to the United States. However, we cannot rely on deterrence alone. We need to ensure that the United States has capabilities on the shelf to prevent and preempt this kind of behavior ahead of the midterms, and we must make ourselves harder to hack through improving our defenses and becoming more resilient. I am proud to be part of a team at the Belfer Center that is releasing a new report this morning, a playbook for state and local officials to improve the cybersecurity of the systems they administer. It represents the culmination of months of fieldwork by the research team, including some exceptionally talented students, which developed recommendations to prepare for the upcoming elections. We also have a playbook to help campaigns protect themselves from hackers. Both reports can be helpful for our allies as well who face similar threats. Both are available on our website. There is every indication that foreign governments will try to sow confusion ahead of and during the next election. This should be of concern to every American, regardless of party. Improving the cybersecurity of campaigns, as well as at the state and local level, both at home and abroad, needs to be a core element of a broader strategy to push back against our adversaries who seek to undermine the confidence we have in the integrity of our elections. Let me conclude my opening remarks by reiterating my appreciation for this committee's bipartisan approach. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just begin by saying what we in the House have advocated here in the legislation that we passed, that I authored and along with Mr. Engel, has been to call for a Cyber Diplomacy Act. I think it's unique. We're not simply asking the Department to maintain the cyber coordinator. What we're asking for here is the creation of a cyber bureau headed by the Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary, and the bureau and its leaders then are empowered, as they must be, are empowered to deal with a full range of cyber issues, including security, including economy, including human rights. So that's the approach the House is taking, and the Senate's been receptive to that idea. So let me go with my question here, Mr. Painter, if I could, or Mr. Miller. So China has emerged as a very aggressive power in cyberspace. And in addition to China's articulation of this idea of cyber sovereignty, Beijing is now aggressively pushing U.S. companies to turn over its technological know-how as the cost of assessing China's enormous market. Obviously, it's in both our national security and economic interests to respond to this technology grab there. And one proposal is to strengthen CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. This committee is looking at a complementary approach of strengthening our export controls in tandem. So, Mr. Miller, if I could start with you, how does the technology industry see this threat, since they've got the most to lose here, and how can Congress best respond?
Thank you for your question, Chairman Royce. Well, in terms of the threat, the technology industry has been consistent in advocating against any policies globally that would require companies to turn over or provide access to source code to governments anywhere. So I mean, it's certainly very concerning indeed. You referenced the efforts that are underway to update, modernize the CFIUS process. In terms of the underlying national security concerns that are articulated in that bill with respect to transfers of technologies that are critical to U.S. national security interests. You know, absolutely, the tech sector agrees that that's a serious concern. As you pointed out, it's highlighted in some of these approaches. You know, I think the question is whether the bill is narrowly tailored to address that goal, and whether it sweeps in kind of ordinary business transactions that do not involve the transfer of critical technology, or whether it might sweep in transactions that are already adequately covered or should be adequately covered by the export control regime. From our perspective, what we are working to ensure is an approach that addresses the underlying national security concerns in a targeted fashion without negatively impacting those, you know, daily business transactions or creating kind of a parallel duplicative export control regime. I mean, from our perspective, ultimately, export controls and CFIUS should work in a complementary, not a duplicative fashion, and we believe there is a way to both update and optimize the current export control system to cover emerging technologies, for instance, and also to update CFIUS in a targeted way that makes sense and helps supplement that.
Well, let me ask Mr. Painter also his views on this.
Yeah, I think it's clear that China has become much more aggressive on the world stage. Among other things, one of the counterparts I had that was created after our office was created was China. China and Russia created counterparts. And they have their own international strategy they put out about a year ago, which champions this idea of absolute sovereignty. And they also, as you noted, have been passing laws in the guise of cybersecurity that are often more about market protection. It's a difficult issue because I think one of the things that we've seen is that they become active in working diplomatically with other countries and trying to, quite frankly, build alliances with the developing world and others to really further their own view of cyberspace. On the company side, we've made some progress. As you know, the agreement with China not to steal intellectual property by cyber means, that was a landmark agreement. It took a while to get us there and a lot of pressure to get us there. That was very helpful.
How about on the enforcement side of that?
Well, I think what we said then, and this is still the policy as far as I know now, is all tools are on the table. We didn't take anything off the table to get that agreement, and sanctions and other tools are there, and we have to think of other tools still. I do worry that, when I see U.S. companies faced with this, and I've dealt with a number of them, they're often unwilling individually to express these issues because they are concerned about the market issues in China. Trade associations, ITI, and others, I think, have been very good interlocutors about this, but that's one of the issues. The other thing I worry about is even if you look at CFIUS and other types of legislation, which are not exactly tailored to this problem, there are things that China is doing in terms of joint ventures and other things that really don't fall within that rubric. So how do you really address this problem in a broader sense? And I think it takes looking at a lot of different tools, including—
And that's why we'll be in consultation with you on the export controls and on the— let's go to Dr. Solmeyer. Do you have any insights that you could share with us on this?
On this particular topic, I agree with my colleagues, but would emphasize the need to strengthen CFIUS. I think that's a critical priority. Thanks.
Very good. We go to Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, quickly, I'd like to start by asking all of our witnesses just a quick yes or no to set the record straight. We can start with Mr. Painter. Do any of you have any reason to doubt the intelligence community's assessment that Russia interfered to influence our 2016 election?
None whatsoever.
No.
Nope.
Thank you. Dr. Solmeyer, the intelligence community reported that the Kremlin interfered to aid Donald Trump and damage Hillary Clinton's candidacy. The Trump administration's CIA director says that the Russians have been doing this in other countries for years and will do so again during our next election. What is Russia's overall goal with this interference? What should the United States do that it is not doing to become more resilient and prepare itself for another round of Putin's election interference?
Thank you. It's an important question, and it's a good baseline way to express first that these Russian activities form a broader part of a strategy that are not limited to cyberspace. They are operating in areas below what we would think of as war, but it's certainly not peace. And they're very active and have no shame in what they are willing to do and the tactics they are willing to employ in these so-called gray zones. I think you can discern sometimes three different motives at times. One is a very straightforward traditional espionage collection in ways to help military and intelligence goals. We've seen that against the United States in many different situations against government networks. Two, the spread of and sometimes also manufacture of disinformation. Here, the objective being the creation of chaos and confusion that undermines their opponent's ability to actually discern the truth. Right? And it's not just hacking. It's not just a cyber question. It's the knowing introduction of false and fake information at the right times, at the right place, on the right topics, to make it so that it becomes much more difficult to get to the bottom of what's going on. The example you can easily point to is the shoot down of the aircraft over Ukraine and the disinformation put out there. The third topic I'll just hit briefly is the increasing desire on the part of the Russians to hold targets at risk. Right? And this is about being able to affect and manipulate critical infrastructure targets when tensions get hot. And the example here would be taking out power in the Ukraine for a little while, a couple years ago. We want to make sure that does not happen here, not at all.
Thank you. Mr. Painter, I was disappointed when I heard that the administration downgraded the State Department's Cyber Diplomacy Office. Hopefully, the Cyber Diplomacy Act will elevate this office again. In the meantime, what do you think downgrading this office will mean for American leadership on cybersecurity and other critical issues?
So I very much hope that the trend reverses. I think we'd built up a lot of momentum, and especially when we're in the midst of an executive order on cyber dealing with diplomacy and other issues, and we had established a leadership position in the world. I think even if it was for a temporary period, stepping or seeming to stepping back from the world stage really empowers our adversaries to try to exploit that and work to advance their agenda, and really gives our allies and partners a reason to question whether the U.S. is going to continue to lead and continue to prioritize these issues. So I think that was, just not the right approach. I very much hope that between the Act and other activities that we can elevate this again at the State Department. I think it's a key 21st century issue, and I hope that happens. And if there's time, Congressman, I also would like to address the question that you just asked of Mr. Solmeyer, too, in terms of some of the things we can be doing. I agree we have not done enough to deter this activity. This will, in fact, happen again, as was stated by the Director of National Intelligence in both administrations, including Mike Pompeo recently. There's a number of things I think we can do actively, including having a clear declarative statement that this is something that we will not countenance, that there will be consequences for this activity coming from the administration. I think you could set up, and this is just not my ideas, but talking to a lot of people in the community, including a lot of former government people and present ones, but we could set up a task force that would really deal with protecting our elections, knowing this is going to happen in 2018 and beyond, that would involve dealing with social media and others, a real interagency task force that would be focused on this issue. I think we can enhance our deterrence tools. I think we do a bad job in deterrence, as I said before, across the board. And then finally, I think there's a number of pieces of legislation, both on the Senate and the House side, that can give us greater tools to protect election systems, and there's a lot more that can be done there.
Mr. Painter, I want to ask you one final question. As I mentioned in my statement, the President has refused, in my opinion, to hold Russia accountable for election interference. He's refused to impose sanctions, which clearly was in the legislation that we passed with over 400 votes on the House floor. So he's refused to impose sanctions or intensify efforts to prevent Putin from trying to undermine our next election. What do you think, let me ask you this, what do you think the President should do in response to this attack on our democracy, and what message does our lack of action send?
I outlined some of this just now, but I would say that, in deterrence, the classic parts of deterrence, other than the deterrence by denial, is that you have a credible response and you have a timely response. And consequences are important. When I was a prosecutor, if we didn't prosecute people, they'd be running around doing crimes every day, right? So you need to have consequences for bad actors, both to deter them and as a consequence for their actions. And if we don't take any action, that itself sets a norm of inaction that makes the activity they're doing seem acceptable, and they'll do it again. And I think it's very likely they will. So given all of that, I think we need to really use all the tools in our toolkit, including sanctions, to continue to send a clear message this is unacceptable. This was a very, very big deal. This was trying to undermine our democracy. Whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, this is a huge deal in the U.S. and around the world, and we've got to do everything we can to try to thwart it. And I think if you don't do actions, and to be sure, you can think of how you're strategically going to approach it, but if you don't do actions, that sends a clear message, hey, this is okay, or at least, hey, this is a costless enterprise.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you.
Mr. Dana Rohrabacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for providing leadership in this area, making sure we have a hearing into a very important issue. It is easy to see that we live in a different world than I grew up in. There was no internet, and when people wanted to sabotage someone else's campaign, they didn't have to go onto the internet or use cyber warfare in order to do it. But now we know that we have this vehicle. We are dependent on the internet to do business. And when we talk about cyber attacks, we're talking about sometimes sabotaging someone, system, so they can't work, or we're talking about the theft of information. And I don't know, frankly, these things were done beforehand, but now we have a new threat, a new challenge, because we have a new technology vehicle. Mr. Miller, I was interested, you just in passing noted that India and China and other countries beside Russia are engaged in this type of activity.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Representative Rohrabacher. There are actually, if you look at the some of the problematic policy provisions that I mentioned at the outset broadly, forced localization types of policies and requiring companies to store their data in country, or you look at some of the potential, the requests for security testing to be conducted by government auditors. Those types of proposals do exist in India specifically.
So we have a lot of hacking going on in this arena, not just in Russia, but throughout the world. By the way, does our government engage in using the internet to place false stories about people who we consider our adversaries?
I really have no personal knowledge of what the government is doing in that regard.
What about you? Does the United States do this?
I have no direct knowledge of that.
So we don't know. We know all about the Russians doing it, but we don't know if our own government does the same thing. I would suggest that maybe our government does the same thing quite often, and having direct knowledge of several instances of that. Now, with that said, let me just ask this.
Will the gentleman yield for a second?
I can't do it because I have limited time, but I'll be happy to have the discussion with you on your time.
I appreciate that.
Let me ask you this. We've heard about the Russians today. The most important issue that came out of this whole, how do you say, this episode in American democracy was that the Russians had hacked into our systems and interfered with our election. And you all agreed that there was something to that. The most important example of that we can all understand, is that they hacked into the Democratic National Committee and got out all of those emails and made public what was in those emails. So the public had this information they wouldn't have otherwise had. But let me ask you this. From a lot of other experts that I have read, that they said it was impossible for the Russians to have been the ones to have done that it was probably done by an insider into the DNC, because the thumb drive where this information was downloaded from someone on the inside, rather than using the internet, which would have taken a lot longer to get that same information. Have you read anything about that? you're the experts, is that analysis that a group of retired intelligence officers have claimed is true? Do you think that's true? Meaning that it was an inside job by what you can see with your expertise into cyber attacks?
So I'll start by saying that you're right, hacking is not new. Influence operations are not new. However, and even there was hacking back in 2008 into both the Republican and Democratic campaigns.
You know, I've only got 15 minutes, so do you disagree with that?
The difference then
Yes.
was it was used to gather intelligence and not weaponized to try to affect our elections. You know, there are lots.
I got to ask you about this.
There were lots of different.
Look, I'm sorry, but it's my time right now.
Right.
They're
And
not
it's
going to
my-
give me
it's my-
one extra minute
Sir, it's
to
my
get your
answer.
answer.
All I'm saying
Mr.
is
Chairman,
that-
I ask for unanimous consent for one extra minute to get them to answer.
Object. No objection.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I
would just say there are
think it
lots
is
of
appalling.
vectors.
I think that type of camaraderie is appalling when we have a witness that is refusing to go to.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we go to Mr. Albio Ceres of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. You know, I'm one of those guys that is on a different scale here. I think that while we sleep, countries like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are plotting how to undermine this country, especially Russia. So, has America really woken up to the fact that this is a real danger to our country? Or we still need to go a little ways more to recognize how dangerous this is to our country? Painter?
So yes, I think we have not gone far enough. I think it should have been a wake-up call. There's been a lot of wake-up calls we've seen from a lot of different threats. The Sony Pictures hack by North Korea, some of the big data thefts, and the effect on our election. I think we need to have a sustained focus on this. This is not a blip. This is going to be repeated in the future, and so we absolutely have to have a sustained focus on this in the future.
Mr. Miller?
I agree that absolutely we need more focus on really the full spectrum of cyber-related threats out there. I mean, we've certainly heard a lot already today about many of the very high-profile hacks, and it's very important. A couple of features of those that have been pointed out already. You do have increasingly sophisticated threats and threat actors, including nation states, increasingly involved in this activity. And then even when we do have bilateral agreements in some instances to not do a specific thing like hack for commercial purposes. The reality is all these other cyber policies that are problematic that we've been talking about can really cause some of the very same issues, for instance, by just requiring companies to turn over source code or things like that. So it's
not just state actors on their own, but state actors using proxies, and they do that because it's more difficult to trace it to them, more difficult to attribute it to them. That's a real concern as well. And so as we look at the spectrum of different threats, and it's the annual threat report in 2017, and also many years before that, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran have been the key threat state actors, and Russia has been one of the most sophisticated.
And how do we respond to that? Mr. Solmeyer,
Gone are the days when the non-state actors were less capable. Non-state actors can be just as capable now as state actors. So the distinction in my mind is now moot. What do we do? In a number of situations, we need to hold the state accountable because the non-state actor is actually a proxy for the state. And when our Justice Department indicted several Russian criminals for the hack on Yahoo, there's a lot of good information in that indictment about that situation.
So that tells me that diplomacy, they can easily get around that, whatever arrangements we make.
No, I mean, diplomacy is one of the tools in our tool set. I absolutely agree that law enforcement and stronger enforcement and giving the tools for that is important. That's what I used to do in one part of my career. Diplomacy is pressing not just the state that's responsible, but other states who are similarly victims of this conduct to take action against the state that's doing it. And that's one of the things in deterrence we have to be much better at.
Mr. Miller, do you have any response to that?
Well, I mean, I think to go back to your previous question that I didn't answer about the the different types of state actors. I mean, that is actually absolutely true that it's not just the state-sponsored cyber activities that we need to worry about. I think
in some states work with these hackers. And
absolutely. I mean, I think another feature of this problem is that it's not just economic rationales behind the hacking. I mean, increasingly we see political or activist type of hacking as well from WikiLeaks, for instance, and others. And it's a very complicated environment in that regard.
My time right now. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We go to Joe Wilson, South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. Mr. Painter, in the FY17 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress expanded the role of the Global Engagement Center to include countering foreign state and non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts that threaten U.S. national security interests as well as the security interests of U.S. allied and partner nations. With this expanded mission, could you please explain or describe the role of the Global Engagement Center and the broader U.S. cyber diplomacy effort?
So the Global Engagement Center was a separate part of the State Department from where I was. We did talk to the Global Engagement Center. As I said previously, if we're really taking this seriously and we're trying to combat all these threats, not just the terrorist threats, but also other states who are trying to influence various operations around the world, I think the Global Engagement Center can and should play an important role, and I think that legislation helps ensure that. If it's properly resourced, if it's properly doing all of the things it needs to do.
And that really is the next point. Is there more that Congress can do to back up the center?
I haven't been at the State Department now for a few months, so I can't say how it's operating currently. I would say that it is an important mission. It's got to be a mission that's done strategically. I think one of the problems we had in that space is if the government is simply saying it, we're not doing the best job. We have to get other interlocutors who have more credibility in the community doing that. That's one of the things the Global Engagement Center has and can continue to do. It's only part of the solution, though. We also have to work with social media companies and maybe create some sort of task force I talked about before to deal with these issues more generally.
We look forward to your input. And Mr. Miller, a persistent problem that's presented itself in cyberspace is attribution. Could you please describe the process of attributing malicious activity in cyberspace and the technical and political challenges associated with attribution? What are the benefits or pitfalls of an international attribution organization, and would all nations participate?
Thank you for the question, Representative Wilson. Absolutely, attribution is a really important piece of the equation here. I am not a technical expert, but by all accounts, we have gotten a lot better collectively at attribution in cyberspace. However, at least based on my knowledge, it is definitely not. It is still more. I mean, it's hard to have absolute 100% certainty in all cases in terms of attribution. As we've been describing, there's a whole host of cyber threat actors involved. Oftentimes, there are various different ways to try to mask an IP address or what have you on the internet. But I think your question does highlight the need for continuing to share cyber threat information and vulnerabilities with our partners and other information, particularly partners internationally, to really try to have as much information as we can to try to get the best information we can about tough issues such as attribution.
Thank you. And Dr. Silmeyer, what is your view about attribution?
Yes, sir. Sophisticated states and companies can and do attribute. Just like anything, nothing is perfect, but gone are the days when attribution as a sort of bumper sticker, gone are those days when attribution was hard to do. It's a complicated process. You use all source methods of intelligence. You don't just rely on an IP address or cyber technical indicators. You throw everything at the book and trying to figure out who did it. And the critical part here is that now companies are in the mix as well, not just governments. And that muddies the water as well a fair amount.
And actually, Mr. Miller, you've already hit on this, but and both of you, the potential of Russia and China working with us, and of course it seems inconceivable, but DPRK any level of attribution from those particular countries?
Well, to the extent you're asking about attribution from North Korea in particular, as I'm sure you know, the Department of Homeland Security did, in fact, attribute the WannaCry attacks to North Korea right before the holidays. And, I certainly, as Mr. Solmeyer says, I think the U.S. or any nation state takes great pains before they publicly attribute, but when they do, I have a high degree of confidence that it's reliable information.
Again, thank each of you for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Before we go to Congresswoman Karen Bass, I think we want her to get her full time. So might I suggest that we can go now. All right, we go now to you. Afterwards, we will recess until the third vote and come back immediately afterwards. Okay?
All right. Thank you so much.
Congresswoman Karen Bass of California.
I appreciate that. Mr. Painter, could you please explain why the administration downgraded your office and what is the status of the office today?
So I don't know. We had a very good, I think, close working relationship with the people at the NSC, with Rob Joyce, with Tom Bossert, and others. This is something where we were continuing to make progress on these issues.
So what were you told?
I think it was part of a larger reorganization where they were trying to get rid of all these special envoys, all the direct reports to the secretary. I think, frankly, there was maybe a lack of understanding of the importance of this issue and how it fit into the
Is it staffed today? Does the office exist?
So the office, as I understand it, my old office still exists. They've kept it together, which I think is critically important.
Who's staffing it?
My former deputy is still there, and several of the people who were just a great team are still there, and that's important.
So what are they doing?
They are working on some of these issues. They're continuing working on it. However, the level of the person who is assigned over there is at a lower level, at a deputy assistant secretary level. He's in a economic reporting chain. As important as those issues are, it doesn't give full voice to all these other issues around deterrence, around incident response.
So what signal do you think that sends?
I think it's an unfortunate one.
Russians and Chinese and other actors.
Look, quite frankly, and I've talked to a lot of our allies and others about this, I think it sends a message, as I said before, to our adversaries that this is an opportunity for them to flex their muscles and try to influence even more than they have the international debate. If we're not there in a leadership role, if it's a signal that this is not as important an issue in the State Department.
So if you take that combined with what's going on today in terms of the attacks on the FBI and the other intelligence agencies, what do you think is happening in preparation for our midterm?
Look, I think we need to do everything we can because the Russians will be there. Other actors could be there. If the goal is to sow chaos, which I think it is, you don't know which party is going to be affected. I mean, it's going to be something where they're going to come back. They're going to try to create chaos. Do
you think they see what's going on here as chaos today?
Well, I think what we see is that the people that we need to defend those networks, the FBI, who I've worked with and have tremendous respect for, the Department of Justice, who I used to work for and have tremendous respect for, if we diminish their ability to fight these types of issues, and our intelligence community, that's shooting ourselves in the foot. We need to be able to deal with these issues.
Do you think we're more vulnerable today in terms of the midterm elections?
I mean, I can't make an assessment about the midterm elections themselves, except for to say, if we don't take action, if we continue to say that, if we continue to not make this a high priority issue and not communicate that this is a high priority issue, one that is really at the top of the agenda, and we will take action. I talked about some of the actions we could take, including a clear declaratory statement and making sure we take actions.
Well, what's a declaratory? So, in addition to a declaratory statement, which I don't think we've done, what type of consequences do you think would stop, in particular, the Russians?
Look, it's hard to assess, but even if you impose consequences on the Russians, whether that will stop them, but it will at least make them think twice about it. And you could do economic sanctions, even greater ones than we have now. You can think about a whole range of options that we have in deterrence, not just economic. We can think about, other law enforcement options. We can think about other options that we can pursue. But we need to be able to communicate that, too, saying we will do these things if you take these actions to try to make.
And last question. I know we need to go to votes. You made specific reference to legislation, and I was wondering if you could be more specific than that in terms of what bills were you talking about?
I know there's a bunch of bills. There's a couple in the House dealing. I think there's one dealing with sanctions. There's one with giving more tools to deter actions. On the Senate side, there is a bill that will help protect election systems. So there's a lot of efforts out there. I think the most important thing is we make sure that the people who are trying to keep this from happening have the tools in place, and that we give the resources and ability to help work with local and state election officials to up their game and have better cybersecurity.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Bass. And so at this point, we will recess. We'll resume immediately following the third vote. We stand in recess. Followed by Mr. Keating. If I could have the attention of the witnesses and the other members, we're going to reconvene at this time. And we will go first to Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida and then to Mr. Bill Keating of Massachusetts with their questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you holding this hearing at this moment. And I think this is such a very important topic, the cybersecurity of the United States of America and around the world. And I've lost my note here. Hang on just a minute. Bear with me for...
Well, as you search for that, I've just received a letter, if I could...
Go ahead.
If you could yield me some time.
Yes, sir.
From Secretary of State, from the Secretary of State announcing that the Department is creating a Bureau for Cyberspace and Digital Economy headed by an Assistant Secretary. I ask unanimous consent that this be included in the record. I think this is a positive step, but we're going to continue to work with the Department and continue to work with our colleagues over on the Senate side to pass the legislation we've passed out of this committee to ensure that this Assistant Secretary and Bureau is empowered to engage on the full range of cyber issues dealing with security and human rights and the economy. And with that, I'd like to yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, I've been here for 6 years, and I remember some of the first meetings we had here in this committee, we started talking about a cybersecurity policy for the United States, and I found it shocking that the United States did not have a definition of what a cybersecurity threat was, how it was defined, if it was amount of life loss, money loss, infrastructure shut down, like a power grid, and then we didn't have the response for that, which I found that much more shocking, to allow us to tell other nations when they do something what they can expect from us. And I'm currently working on legislation that would complement Chairman Royce's Cyber Diplomacy Act with a deterrent and response mechanism. One limitation of U.S. cyber deterrence is that the United States, as I mentioned, does not have a formal process to name and shame perpetrators when they are identifiable. We've seen how effective naming and shaming can be in other contexts like the annual Trafficking in Persons report or the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And the goal here is not to shame people, but the goal here is to get people to be honest actors in the world, I guess the world we live in. And if people don't follow and respect other nations' rules and laws, you get a breakdown of society. So my question to all three of you is, do you think it would be helpful to create a designation for known malicious cyber actors, or what should a designation process for known malicious cyber actors look like? If you guys want to just kind of go down the panel, and I've got one more follow-up question if I have time.
I think it's an interesting idea. I think there are some things you have to be careful about, though. Even when the U.S. knows and can attribute the conduct, sometimes they want to make that public, and that's useful, as we did in the case of North Korea, as we recently did in North Korea again, Russia and some others, and China. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you want to use it as a tool to then go back privately to that country and tell them basically this is unacceptable as a predicate to doing more. So that's one issue. The other issue, I'd say, is that I don't know the scope of the naming and shaming you're talking about, if it's for non-state actors, for like criminal activity that's coming from their country, one of the challenges there is sometimes those countries simply don't have the tools to deal with this.
Let me ask Mr. Miller that, because I think you're the one that brought up that a lot of the proxy groups are working with state actors. I think that was you. Yes. Your button, please.
Sorry. Yes, sir. I did bring that up. Well, and I think I would agree with that. We don't want to look at this too narrowly to only focus on the state actors, because they are working with a whole variety
Sure.
of others. So, you know, to just amplify what Mr. Painter was saying, you know, I think it's definitely an interesting idea, but we want to just proceed carefully, because we don't want to put the focus, you know, on one area and then have, you know, others kind of running free, if you will, and not and kind of leading to a false sense of security.
Right.
In that regard.
Dr. Solmeyer?
Mr. Congressman, I do agree. I find the idea interesting. The trick for me would be to balance between strategic ambiguity and when you really want to articulate precisely what actions will trigger what responses. It's always a balance.
And I think we need to do that because right now there's not, and so there's so much ambiguity and gray areas that the obvious thing that countries are going to do is keep expanding that and pushing that. And what sort of consequence should the United States impose on groups that have committed attributable cyber attacks on the United States? And we already talked about the actors that are acting on their behalf. Mr. Painter?
We have to have a menu of options. Right now we have diplomatic options to bring pressure, not just by us, but by our allies and partners. We have economic things like sanctions. We have law enforcement tools. We have cyber operational tools, which I think are sometimes often overrated, and we have kinetic tools, which are unlikely to use in a cyber event.
Right, and we want to have that defined. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think what we need to do is really expand our tool set, have more tools, work with partners to bring these consequences and do it in a more timely fashion.
All right, I'm out of time, and I thank you, gentlemen, for your patience.
We go to Mr. William Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to say once again, thank our witnesses. It's great to have former officials. It's great to have councils and think tanks. It's great to have people from facilities like JFK School and my home state. But I would say again, it's important to have actual members of the administration, of the Trump administration here. It's important for our committee, and I mean that as no criticism to you, Mr. Chairman, because I know you've pushed for this too. But the continued lack of having these people here is, at best, indifference. Worst case, arrogance. So with that, I'll get the attention of our witnesses and thank them for being here once again. Mr. Painter, you said that basically it's irrelevant, if I have my notes, what we do without a deterrent response. And you said that absent that response, virtually it guarantees us a reoccurrence of this behavior, and the norm of inaction is a big deal. Now, the fact that we didn't move on the Russian sanctions will have an impact in that regard. We can't go back at their elections because in Russia, opponents either end up imprisoned or poisoned or dead or missing. But in our country, we're open to this. I was very concerned, with the public information that in 29 states, it's been reported publicly, that they were actually the Russians were actually into our voting apparatus. Can you tell us, beyond just the bots and everything they're doing from to really change attitudes and use that kind of propaganda here, what about actually being involved in the voting apparatus? What dangers does that present? Any of you, but Mr. Painter, if you could start.
I mean, it presents a real danger. Now, in some sense, the U.S. system has some resiliency because there's so many different states and jurisdictions that have their own ways of doing voting. On the other hand, you can imagine an attacker getting in, either not just changing voting machines, but also doing things with respect to voter rolls and registrations and all kinds of other things that could, at the very least, create uncertainty and havoc during an election. That's all you need to do, right? You don't need to actually change the result. Creating uncertainty itself could delegitimize an election. So I think that is a huge issue. That's why we need to do everything we can also to work with the state and local authorities to protect their systems.
Yeah. Mr. Miller?
Thank you. Yes, yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, absolutely. I mean, one of the other items I think the potential threats to voting machines and voting systems highlights is just how frankly we're living in a world when we talk about the Internet of Things and other connected cyber-physical devices where there are more and more attack vectors that we all need to protect, both industry and government working together. So that further highlights the need for a well-functioning State Department. But it's not just the State Department that we're talking about here today. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but cyber is a team sport, and Department of Homeland Security, to their credit, has been doing a lot of work on this topic.
I was just going to, on that subject, I'll interrupt, but I know Mr. Salma has reports coming out in that regard that will be helpful. But you just mentioned Homeland, and it's all of government, whole government approach to this. I'm concerned that the threats to the grid that are there. We issued requirements to bolster our nuclear reactors, our nuclear power plants, to make them stronger, more resilient against the cyber attack. Yet the NRC alone, in my district, waived that requirement. Now, don't you think that the NRC by themselves shouldn't be in that position? Shouldn't there be, if there's a whole-of-government approach, shouldn't there be input from the Department of Homeland Security, from state, from other entities of government?
Look, it's a classic risk management issue, right? And that's a high risk, very high impact if things happen. And I'd say you need to be extraordinarily careful on how you do these things. And I think it would benefit from the intelligence community, from the other communities or our government that could pass on information, so that could be a more reasoned decision.
I have 30 seconds left. So I couldn't agree more. The NRC alone being able to do that without the input of our intelligence agencies, it makes no sense whatsoever. And I know, Mr. Sotomayor, you wanted to get to that other question.
Well, just to say, I think the principles are the same, which is I don't want to bet the farm on deterrence. I'd much rather make us much harder to hack and prevent the bad guy from being able to act. You can look at our playbooks for state and local officials to do that for elections. We should also be having the same facilities you described. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
We go to Mr. Tom Garrett of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask first, Mr. Miller, I presume, sir, you're an attorney? That's
yes,
a yes or no question.
Yes,
thank you. I don't have a lot of time. Let me ask you this. Would foreign interference in elections be easier if sensitive national security information was kept on a private server? That's a yes or no question too, sir. Yes or no, sir? Mr. Painter, would foreign interference in elections be more difficult or less if sensitive information was kept on a private server?
Depends on the security of the server.
Okay. If it were a private server kept in a bathroom closet in a Denver loft, might that impact it? Would that be a highly secure server based on your training experience? Mr. Solmeyer, yes or no?
Sorry, it does depend on the security setup of each server.
Okay, you guys are absolutely correct. And it shocks me, though, with your amazing credentials, that when asked Mr. Miller and Mr. Solmeyer if you were familiar with the United States interfering in foreign elections, that you went, I don't know, because the United States media has covered this extensively. In fact, Nina Agarwal in the Los Angeles Times, December 21st, 2016, wrote a story entitled, "The U.S. is no stranger to interfering in the elections of other countries." Are any of you familiar with the U.S. interfering in the elections of other countries via open source information? Any of you, yes or no? Okay, I'm running out of time, gentlemen. If someone kept information that was sensitive, of a national security, politically sensitive nature on a private server, and they were found to have done such acts, would it be would it be useful to punish that information to prohibit or prevent that sort of behavior in the future? Okay, no yes or no answers there? Okay, and if you heard that somebody had reached out from the United States Senate to a foreign power, say, I don't know, the Russians, and said, will you work with me? I'll help you get media opportunities. It's important to, and I quote, counter the policies of this administration. Would that be troubling? Okay, no answers on that. Would it be troubling if a member of this elected body had reached out to a foreign government, say, I don't know, the Russians, and said, it's important to undermine his prospect for re-elections? I will help you get contacts with the U.S. media. Would that be troubling? No answers. Are any of you gentlemen familiar with the story in the London papers from 1992 detailing Senator Ted Kennedy's reaching out to the Russians to interfere in the 1984 elections? No? Okay. Are any of you familiar with the nuclear freeze movement? Any of you? No? Okay. Are any of you familiar with the funding mechanisms of the nuclear freeze movement and their activities in the United States presidential elections? Would you be shocked to learn that the nuclear freeze movement was largely funded by the Soviet Union and that they worked against the Reagan elections in 1980 and 84? Crickets? Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yield his time to...
Mr. Chairman, I take that back. I'd yield the balance of my time to my colleague, Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much. And let me just note for the record, we have witnesses who are unable to give direct answers to things as important as this. Reflects on your integrity and your knowledge base. I don't know which. We'll let whoever's looking at this decide. Also, let me note that for 30 years, I have never turned down a colleague when he asked for an extra minute in a situation like we had earlier. That discourtesy is unfortunate, Mr. Chairman, as you have tried to develop a bipartisan camaraderie here, even when you ask tough questions like what we just heard. And I think that should give us all a little something to think about. Let me note also for the record, Mr. Painter intentionally used time that was allocated to finding a truth in order to obscure the dissemination of information based on a question by a member of Congress.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that order be maintained in this committee, that the integrity of these witnesses not be impugned, and that Mr. Rohrabacher doesn't speak for this committee when he makes that kind of assessment.
Mr. Chairman, I yielded my time to Mr. Rohrabacher, and I'd ask that he be granted the time taken by this gentleman to whom I did not yield time.
There is 50 seconds remaining in the time.
I also find it absolutely unforgivable that another member would use limited time to make to interfere with a member's right to ask a very pertinent question. Now, and we got 30 seconds, so I'll ask you the yes or no question that you refused to answer before. Is it more likely, when knowing that as has been reported by people who are retired intelligence officers, that it is highly unlikely that the Russians could have been the ones who hacked into the Democratic National Committee and made those emails public? That instead, it was highly likely that it was an inside job? Yes or no?
Sir, I do not accept that.
Okay, fine. You won't see us. Won't say that. What about you?
I'm not exactly sure.
Okay, what about you?
Honestly.
So we have witnesses today who can't say anything that would be damaging to the Democratic Party or to one side of this argument. Shame on you.
Sir, to be clear, I'm concerned about any interference by
you do not have the floor.
Time has expired. All time has expired. We go now to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Well, first of all, I want to apologize to these witnesses that you were just subjected to that discourteous behavior, and I certainly want to applaud you for your integrity, your candor today, your service to our country. And I'd like to begin. It's one thing to be unwilling to respond to foreign interference in our elections, in cyber attacks in particular, but it's quite another thing to speak in a way and to describe Russian interference in our elections as a hoax, as fake news, to discredit intelligence agencies that have done this work, have fired the FBI director because of the Russian thing. So my question is, how does the behavior like that undermine our efforts to protect our democracy and protect us from these kinds of cyber attacks? Does it enhance it, or does it make it more difficult? Mr. Painter.
Look, as I said before, I think we have to be very clear that this is a huge issue and that we're not going to countenance this happening again. I think some of the things I outlined about what we should be doing about this needs to focus on the future, too, because this is going to happen again. I think we need to be clear and clear-eyed of how important and how big an issue this was, and that this is something that's not acceptable. The intelligence community has concluded this in both administrations.
And is it important to have a strong declaration from the leader of the country that says this will not be tolerated, we will make certain there are consequences if you do this again, and create some national commitment to protect our democracy and our electoral institutions?
Yes, that's the kind of declaratory statement I was talking about earlier.
Mr. Miller, do you agree that that's necessary?
I think I absolutely agree that the types of policies that are expressed in the Cyber Diplomacy Act, I mean, should be loudly broadcast. You know, everything we've been talking about, keeping the internet open and free, secure, et cetera. I would agree.
Dr. Selmayr?
Yes, I agree.
Okay, thank you. So with respect to kind of what we're doing to respond to this very real threat, CIA Director Pompeo recently said there's no question the Russians are coming back in another attempt to interfere with our democratic institutions, which, as you say, should not be a Republican or Democratic issue. It's an issue that's important to every single American in our country. When we had the Attorney General before us, he said, and I quote, "I've not followed through to see where we are on that," referring to an effort to review our practices and our policies and legislative infrastructure to support our democratic institutions. And he said very candidly, "Are we at the level we need to be at? I don't think so." Are you aware of any effort underway by our government, by the administration, to prevent a reoccurrence of foreign interference by a foreign adversary in our elections in 2018?
I'm not aware of any high-level effort. That's why I'm saying that we have, time is running out, and this is an issue that we need to take seriously. And I think there are certainly a lot of professionals in the government that are looking at this issue, at the FBI and in the intelligence agencies, and really across the government. I think this needs to be a top priority.
Mr. Miller, are you aware of any effort, high-level effort, coordinated at the of the administration to respond to this very real threat in the elections, which are only 10 months away?
It's difficult to comment on the level per se, sir, but I am aware. I do a lot of work with the Department of Homeland Security. I do know that the Department of Homeland Security is very much focused on this threat and working operationally, for instance, with the states and others to try to, help.
And I would agree with that. I've seen that too.
Dr. Sotomayor?
I would reiterate Mr. Miller's point about DHS, but no, at a broader national coordinated level, no.
And I think I'd just like to conclude by making reference to what Mr. Keating said. It would be very useful to actually hear from administration officials and allow the world to hear in a very strong declarative statement, not only that they acknowledge that this happened, but their commitment to be certain that it never happens again, and that they are working in an interagency way to ensure that that happens. I would love to hear from members of the administration before our committee to actually talk about that. The final thing I want to ask you about is we passed the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions recently, and we, of course, learned that the administration has failed to implement the sanctions that we impose as a direct result of Russian aggression and Russian interference in our elections. Some people have tried to explain that away and said, well, just the threat of doing that has been a deterrent, but of course it was also to punish them for interfering in American elections. What is the impact of the failure of the administration not to implement these sanctions against Russia, both in terms of their behavior and what kind of message it sends to the rest of the world?
So I don't discount that the threat could have an effect, as it did with the Chinese and bringing them to the table. However, this is a huge issue, and the fact that we haven't done it yet, and I know there's some confusion about whether we'll do it in the future, we need to take action. We need to make sure that there are consequences. Without consequences, there's not deterrence, and there's an invitation to do it again.
I would just say it risks emboldening our adversaries very much.
We go now to Ann Wagner of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on the issue. I was disturbed last month when China's civil aviation regulator demanded an apology from Delta airline for listing Taiwan as a country on the Delta website. Also last month, China blocked Marriott websites and intimidated the country into groveling and apologizing for listing both Taiwan and Tibet as separate countries. China's actions are egregious violations of basic expressions and speech. They were also part of coordinated efforts to undermine regional stability. Just a couple weeks ago, China unilaterally announced that it would open disputed air routes through the Taiwan Strait. My colleagues and I wrote a letter to the Chinese ambassador calling on China to enter into a constructive dialogue with Taiwan. It is entirely inappropriate for China to use cyber retaliation against American companies to push its political agenda and aggression against Taiwan, and the administration should be responding to this, I believe, at the highest level. Mr. Painter, in 2014, Congress authorized the administration to sanction foreign persons that commit cyber espionage. What progress has the administration made in sanctioning Chinese actors that repeatedly steal American IP?
Thank you for that question. About that same time, I think the administration also came out, the administration then came out with an executive order listing sanctions for the first time that would apply to cyber activities, a range of cyber activities, including the activities you described. And I think that the fact that those sanctions were in place were indeed one of the things, among others, that drove the Chinese to come to the table, and after for a long time saying there was no difference between normal intelligence gathering and taking trade secrets to benefit your commercial sector, for a long time saying there was no difference at all, and they didn't do either of them, saying there was a difference, and they agreed not to do the latter. And I think that was a landmark thing that was then replicated at the G20. Australia has reached an agreement with them. Germany has reached an agreement. The UK has reached an agreement. That's important. Now, I do agree with you.
But what progress has been made, I guess, is what I'm concerned about, because it's my sense, to be perfectly honest, that both the Obama and the Trump administrations have kind of shied away from using that authority.
Look, I think that has to be a tool in your toolkit, and I think you have to be ready and willing to use it. And as I said earlier, Sanctions were not taken off the table when that agreement was reached. If there is a violation, if that agreement is violated, that has to be one of the tools and should be one of the tools that's used. I would say that that sanctions order from back in 2014 or 2013 has been underused. I think we need to use that as one of our tools more aggressively in the right circumstances, not just with China, but with others, when we see conduct that rises a certain level.
Thank you for that testimony, because I believe it's been underutilized also. Mr. Miller, 2 years ago, Congress created a private right of action for victims of trade secret theft in U.S. courts. Have companies doing business in China begun taking advantage of this cause of action?
Thank you for the question. I'm actually really not aware of whether or not there have been a number of cases filed under that cause of action.
I'm just wondering if there are examples of companies bucking the trend of preferring not to report or remedy losses.
I mean, I do know that certainly ITI's companies take intellectual property rights very seriously, and as I mentioned earlier, it's concerning some of the government policies that we see around the globe that put U.S. companies or any company's intellectual property at risk.
Relatedly, would you recommend that the Department of Justice direct additional resources towards prosecuting trade secret theft?
Trade secret theft I mean, I think I would, yes, sure.
They put forward this private right of action 2 years ago. We did here in Congress, and I just don't see it utilized, and I see harm coming to many of our companies. Mr. Solmeyer, in my brief time left, I believe that Russia issued a requirement that would force companies to submit the locations of data centers and servers to Russia's ICT regulators. Is this a security concern, given that hackers and other malintentioned actors might know where to look for important data?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, I do believe that would be one among many security concerns that the regulators there enforce on companies. Yes.
Outrageous.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I believe my time has expired. I get back.
Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Painter, as the Chairman noted, the State Department just announced that it plans to establish a new bureau for cyberspace and the digital economy. Although elevating the issue of cyber diplomacy is positive, it strikes me as odd that the Bureau would report to the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment rather than the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. Would the new Assistant Secretary be able to focus on the full range of cybersecurity and other critical issues under this arrangement?
I quite agree with you. I think that that's not the ideal arrangement. I think the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, by their title and their responsibilities, really has to have that economic perspective. That's an important perspective, to be sure. But if you look at all these issues, as I talked about in my written testimony, that include hard issues of security, deterrence, incident response, issues around cyber operations and military actions in cyberspace, that does not fit close to in that substantive rubric. So you really need something more broad-based. I think the committee's recommendation to be under the Undersecretary of Political Affairs makes a lot more sense. It is a neutral reporting chain. It can deal with security issues, human rights issues, but also don't fit. There are sometimes conflicts between human rights issues and economic issues, for instance, and security issues and economic issues. You want a place where you can have full voice of all those issues, particularly the security issues that are really facing us today. And so I would say that I applaud the fact that they have taken action. I think it's great they're elevating it. That's exactly what should be done. But I would not put it under the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. I put it at a minimum under the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, where you can have full voice of these issues.
No, thank you. And I guess let me ask you three gentlemen, whoever wants to answer. Besides sitting on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm also on the Intelligence Committee. So as you know, we've had for over a year now a front row seat in understanding how Russian hacking and basically cyber operations has affected our democracy. But the threats, as we've mentioned here in the committee, come not only from them but other nations and non-state actors. So one of the issues that I've been working on, and I know others have also, is the eventual development of mutual cyber defense treaties. Right now, you think about the existence of NATO, for example, which mostly involves mutual defense when there is a physical intrusion of one country against another. In your vision of the future, what is the future for any kind of mutual response to cyber attacks and cyber intrusions, if there is one?
Look, I think that's paramount, actually. I think that as we look at sharpening our deterrence tools, one of the things we need to do is work with like-minded partners who can act together to sanction bad actors in cyberspace. And whether it's done by a treaty or it's some more loose arrangement, which I think might be more flexible and valuable in this case, like we did with, for instance, the Proliferation Security Initiative or in money laundering or other areas, which I think probably may work better in the short term, that's important. I can also say that some bilateral arrangements, like with Australia and others, on larger defense issues, we've added cyber to that and said that mutual defense treaties with those organizations would also involve cyber, and NATO has stepped up their game on cyber, including it in the last summit, declaring it a domain.
I would just say I think it's a great idea, Congressman, to be pushing those kinds of arrangements. I would try to distinguish at times between when the treaty would come into effect during a crisis and in steady state. And I wouldn't want to just reserve it for when things get hot. I'd want to make sure that the information sharing, the work is happening on a steady state basis, so you never have to really invoke the ones in a crisis.
Sure.
Just to briefly add to those comments of both of my fellow witnesses, which I agree with, you know, I absolutely think it's a good idea. You know, as I mentioned, I mean, it's clear we need all the tools in the tool shed, as Mr. Painter testified earlier, and multilateral agreements and vehicles are really important. And you know, as well as the work that's been done at NATO, certainly at a higher level, there have been some good agreements made in these areas at the G7 and G20, and then also if you look at, you know, other tools like the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, for instance, there are ways to work together on these issues.
And it strikes me right now as a big gap or void in our defense, really, that this is not fully fleshed out, essentially, that there is no kind of comprehensive agreement among friendly nations, at least, or even, you know, strong bilateral agreements on a mutual cyber response, and what exactly, when you would respond and how you would respond, whether that involves private companies, for example, in the United States. So my time is up, but thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony.
If the gentleman would yield, I want to make it clear, we passed legislation to direct what Mr. Joaquin has suggested here, direct that change in law, and that bill's in the Senate. And we're going to continue to engage with the Department on who this new Assistant Secretary reports to. However, the Department has made clear that this position will handle national security issues. So I want to point that out, including national security level cyber incidents and promotion and adoption of a national process and programs that enable foreign territorial cyber threat detection, prevention, and response, and build foreign capacity to protect the global network. So I think that with respect to the legislation we've moved into the Senate, we're starting to see a movement, and I especially thank the members of this committee for their engagement on this issue here today. We now go to Congresswoman Norma Torres of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to begin by thanking our panelists for being here. Although I wasn't here earlier, during the earlier discussion, I want to tell you that this committee really prides itself from working on a bipartisan way, and we often truly enjoy the folks and the dialogue that we have with our guests. So I apologize, it's not reflective of the entire committee. Certainly it's not reflective of me. And I'm eager to hear your feedback on the issues that I'm going to cover. According to the Freedom House 2017 Freedom on the Net report, governments around the world have dramatically increased their efforts to manipulate information on social media. We have seen this in our own hemisphere. Guatemala, for example, there are armies of paid trolls who are actually working to discredit the fight against corruption in the country. I don't know if they are tied to the government or not, but they are called net centers. And they are working to undermine the work that we are doing in that country, and we have significant U.S. Assistance in that country in the Northern Triangle of Central America. So how do you get more information about these net centers and other paid trolls? And how do we find out who is actually paying for them? And how do we push back on those efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think gathering that information involves, for instance, working with our posts around the world in those countries and with the intelligence community as well and the law enforcement community. I think the way we push back is I am concerned. I follow Freedom House's reports, and I think over time, freedom online has been challenged around the world, and this is a huge issue, and we've seen it by repressive regimes, and we've seen it increasingly in other places as well. And so there's a number of things I think we could do. Our Democracy and Human Rights part of the State Department does a number of grants around the world to promote freedom online and also to protect dissidents and others in their own cybersecurity. There's something called the Freedom Online Coalition that the U.S. was a founding member of, which is, I forget how many states it is now, it's over 30 that are around the world who value freedom online and deal with these issues and actually come up with really good policies on these issues. And this is an issue I think is ripe for that. They've looked at things like network shutdowns and other issues in this space. So I think we really, and one of the things that we used to do in the State Department is we would raise freedom online in all of our bilateral discussions with other countries. And we'd have these all-of-government discussions. I'd have someone from our Democracy and Human Rights shop there to talk about these issues. We need to continue to do that. This is a big deal. We need to make sure security is not used as a proxy by countries to overtake basic freedoms like freedom online, so that has to be part of our policy.
Thank you, Congresswoman. To that, I would add, we've certainly appropriately talked a lot about the security policy and security challenges here today and during this hearing. And I think few would question the important economic element of a lot of what we're talking about here today, particularly cross-border data flows. But I think your question highlights another really key element of frankly the Cyber Diplomacy Act and also what we're talking about, which is this these norms and values that this country supports, a free and open internet, we have a First Amendment, free speech, privacy. All these issues are really important as well, and that's why it's so important to have the State Department and other U.S. government entities out there internationally trying to influence the rest of the global community toward that way of thinking, because it is under assault in a lot of different ways.
It's a free and open internet, and we absolutely want to continue to have that, but it's a free and open internet for people, not necessarily for trolls or paid trolls.
Sure, absolutely, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think my time is almost up, so I'm not going to go into the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We'll go to Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. Thank you for having this meeting. And I just want to take a moment to thank you for your longstanding commitment and dedication to the bipartisanship within this committee and the commitment to work together. And I mention that in the context of what I feel was an outrageous and unjustified attack on our witnesses. I appreciate you being here and sharing with us your perspectives. I am grateful for the work you have done and continue to do, and I hope that we don't see what we saw again. And thank you for talking about the increasingly important topic of cybersecurity. I've said this before in this committee, but it's too important not to repeat again. The U.S. intelligence agencies found that Russia did, in fact, interfere in the 2016 presidential election, and there is no doubt in my mind that they will do it again. But it's not just me saying this. Last July, the Director of National Intelligence, Daniel Coates, said there was no dissent, I'll repeat, no dissent inside United States intelligence agencies about the conclusion that Russia used hacking and fake news to interfere in our election. And just last month, the CIA Director, Mike Pompeo, stated he believes Russia would seek to do so again. I will quote him, quote, "I have every expectation they will continue to try and do that," end quote. I share that. And just to lift two statements from the prepared testimony that the witness has shared with us. Mr. Painter, you said the U.S. did not foresee the hybrid threat posed by Russia's cyber-enabled attempt to undermine and influence the 2016 election that goes to the core of our democracy. And I think that's critical. This is the foundation of our democracy, and every American should have the right to know that their vote will be counted and that the integrity of their vote and the vote as a whole will be protected. And Dr. Solmeyer, you noted that deterring a repeat of this conduct must be a priority for the entire United States government and indeed for all nations whose elections are susceptible to Russian interference. And I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, this administration has not acted to secure our election systems and has not acted to punish those responsible for the 2016 meddling. This administration is leaving the door open for Russia to interfere again. This is not just horrifying, it is unacceptable. Congress passed and the President signed into law the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. Yet the administration has ignored the law by not imposing the strong sanctions laid out by CAATSA. That's why I continue to raise the alarm regarding the seriousness of this situation and why I joined together with my colleague, former Chairman Ilyana Roslatnin of this committee, Chairman of the subcommittee, to introduce the Defending Elections from Threats by Establishing Red Lines, or the Deter Act. This bill would make clear that there will be consequences for those who interfere in our elections and would ensure the United States government had an actual strategy to prevent such interference. So I'd like to ask the witnesses today a number of questions. First, what do you believe Putin hopes to achieve by interfering in our democratic process? And to what degree of certainty do you believe he will seek to do so in the elections coming up in November?
My sense, and I think what the intelligence community has said too, is that to sow chaos, distrust, to undermine democratic systems both here and around the world, that's, I think, the ultimate goal. And I think the likelihood this is going to happen in 2018 and also around the world is incredibly high. There's no reason it wouldn't happen.
Mr. Miller?
I don't see any evidence to suggest that it is not likely to happen again, for sure.
Thank you. Dr. Solmeyer?
I think the motive is for Putin to increase his and Russia's relative power. That's why they're doing what they're doing, and yes, it seems inevitable they'll be doing it again.
And to some extent, do you have a sense that the administration's failure to respond is likely to embolden the Russians and embolden Putin in their efforts to undermine our democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be strong. We need to be clear about what the consequences are. Whether that deters them or not, I don't know, but we need to be as clear as we can about that because it is likely to happen again.
Dr. Solmeyer, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yes, we have to, but we can't rely on it, and that's why my colleagues and I at the Belfer Center have tried to go about helping state and local officials protect themselves as much as possible.
Okay, and we are 9 months away from the election, 9 months from tomorrow. What should the administration be doing? What more can we do to help make sure that every vote will count, that every American knows that the integrity of their vote will be protected?
So I outlined some of these earlier, but one of them is exactly what Mr. Solmeyer said, working with the state and local authorities, and DHS is doing some of this, but really upping that game to protect those systems, to make sure they're secure. That's the technical part. Convening an interagency group at a high level to really focus on this threat, wherever it's coming from, whether it's Russia or other countries, that we can really deal with this, enhancing our deterrence posture and things and tools that we can use for deterrence, and coming up with a really strong declaratory message about what the problems are, what the consequences will be for doing this. And finally, I think working, as has been happening, but working with social media and others to make sure that we're trying to cut off those areas of attack.
Mr. Miller?
I would focus again on DHS and the role that they play there. I mean, you know, again, as has been mentioned a few times, they are working with local officials, and that's absolutely important. You know, it's also very important that, you know, DHS is kind of on the front lines of the public-private partnership between industry. You know, and working with industry partners, you know, and also you know, some of the things that stretch beyond this issue, like sharing threat information between the government and industry to try to figure out what's happening and avoid it is really important.
I've gone well past my time. Thank you again for your testimony today. Chairman, thank you for having this hearing. I hope we will continue to focus on this very important issue. I yield back.
Thank you. And our last questioning comes from Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
I want to build on the gentleman from Illinois' questioning.
It's always nice to have an office. Give it importance. Give it the highest possible title. But if we're not serious about cybersecurity, it's just an office. We know that Russia cyber hacked for the purpose of affecting our election. And Congress acted. Congress passed CATSA. And every section of it that's mandatory is ignored. So one wonders, why create offices if the executive branch, I mean, they could, why are we here? It's much warmer back in California. I'm here to try to legislate. We pass laws and the president just ignores them. So let's go through. CATSA section 225 says the president shall impose sanctions on those who invest in certain deep or Arctic oil locations with Russia, provided a September 1st, 2017 deadline. Nothing was done. Then we have the bank transactions with specially designated nationals. No bank has been sanctioned for a significant transaction with a Russian specially designated national. That's Section 226 of CATSA. But of greatest concern is Section 231, because on this one, we know what the administration is going to do. They have said officially, we refuse to follow the statute because our oath to the Constitution means nothing, and frankly, Congress means nothing. Because that law says that there have to be sanctions against those who do business with Russia's defense and intel complexes. Now, it doesn't have a waiver provision, also ignored by the administration. What do? They issue a press release basically saying, Congress, thanks for passing a law that says we shall do something. We've determined it's unnecessary. We're not going to do it. This is something that I think the Russians would understand. Their Duma is pretty much an advisory body. When it was initially created, it was an advisory body to the Tsar. And I feel that perhaps we should adjust the pay here to be no higher than that of the 1905 Duma, since our legislation has no more effect, or our legislative actions. I'll ask any of the witnesses, how are we going to have an effective person at in the State Department working on cyber issues if we have a policy of not doing anything when the most vital parts of our country are attacked through a cyber hack? Mr. Painter.
So structure is important, but you're quite right. Structure alone doesn't solve the problem. You have to have structure.
Structure can actually make the problem worse by disguising the fact that you're doing nothing about the problem.
Structure is not the only thing. You need a good structure to actually lead this and communicate to the rest of the world it's important. However, you also need strong.
Well, I think we've communicated to the world that it's not important.
But you're quite right. You need strong policies to actually enforce this and make sure that when you have attacks on this, election attacks or other attacks too, that there are consequences for those actors. And part of that's deterrence, but part of that's responding to incidents. And we need to do this. I hope this new Bureau actually does this and is empowered to do this, and that's going to be important.
Okay. Now, you served as the State Department's coordinator for cyber issues, running an office that was eliminated days before you were scheduled to testify before the committee last summer. A lower-level office was created in its stead. What did we lose by actually going backward on this rather than forward?
Look, I'm heartened that the State Department is seeing to create a higher level structure. That's great. Again, I have problems about where it reports, given the range of issues that it involves, because people are prisoners of their perspective, quite frankly, and someone who's an economic undersecretary is going to be in that perspective. However, we had a lot of momentum going. And to say, for a 6-month period or longer that this was not, or communicate this was not a high priority, has an effect, both with our adversaries and with our friends. And I don't understand why we did that. I think when we have a strategy in place to make it even higher up, great. but why interrupt that in the interim?
Unless you want to signal to the world and to Moscow that it isn't important. Look, I'm a co-sponsor of H.R. 3776, the Cyber Diplomacy Act. We passed this in the House. I think it had overwhelming support. We need U.S. International engagement on these cyber issues, but just boxes in the State Department chart don't accomplish anything if you're not willing to take action. I yield back.
Let me just clarify that the administration has taken steps to implement CASTA. They've briefed staff on both sides of the aisle at this point. Let me just make this point on their approach, which, and this is the point I want to make. Instead of sanctioning our allies that buy Russian weapons, what they are doing at this point is pressuring those allies to wind down those sales. I just want that understood.
If the gentleman will yield.
But of course.
First of all, law is law. You can't say we're going to violate the law because we've got a better deal to achieve your purpose.
I understand that in terms of their briefing with our staff here, they understand or they articulate that this complies with the letter and spirit of the law as they now implement, without going through a whole debate in terms of what was laid out in the law and their methodology. I'm just explaining.
Turkey is going to give $2.5 billion to the military complex of Russia, and they're not going to be sanctioned, and we're going to be told that the fact that you've passed a law doesn't matter. We're not even going to even look at the waiver provisions of the law. We're going to ignore the law. And we've got a better idea, and we're smarter than Congress. And trust us, don't pass we're there on your side, but we're going to ignore your legislation. The fact is, I think Turkey fully understands they can send $2.5 billion to the Russians and to their military complex, and nothing will be done by this administration except they'll tell us privately and publicly that they know better and that they're really on our side and they're really going to achieve our purposes.
Let me just add, if reclaiming my time, it is up, well, the way it's written, it is up to the administration to determine what constitutes a significant transaction, but they've also made clear to us in their discussions that these designations are forthcoming. So I'm just, for the record, clarifying those points. I do know we do have one last.
If you'll yield for just a second. If the administration wants to go public and say $2.5 billion from Turkey is not a significant transaction, let them have the guts to do so in public. I yield back.
And with that, I think we should go to our remaining member here with questions, and I'm going to, at this point, give Mike McCall the chairman's chair here, since we're supposed to be in the Foreign Affairs Committee with Secretary Mnuchin, or in the Financial Services Committee at this moment with Secretary Mnuchin. I thank all of our witnesses for their patience today, especially given the votes that we had across the building. Thank you.
Let me recognize myself, and I chair the Homeland Security Committee, but I really enjoy being on this committee. It's a great intersection of similar issues, and cyber is really one of them. And I think I've done a lot on Homeland in terms of legislation, and I think at the State Department, and Chris Painter and I go way back at DOJ, cyber is a mission I'd like to see elevated at the State Department. It's the only department that can work with other countries to establish rules of the road, if you will, where we exist in a world where there are no, as you mentioned, real consequences to a lot of these cyber events that we've been discussing. And I just want to bring up one because I think it involves probably all three of you and myself, and that is the breach of 20 million security clearances at OPM, where they stole mine, and I'm sure Mr. Painter's, and our fingerprints and all that. Were there any consequences to that breach? Mr. Painter.
I think there were a lot of things said during that, after that. I think one of the problems there is espionage. Every country around the world does intelligence gathering. If that is classic espionage, if that's what that was, that's harder to deter, quite frankly, because every government, you're not going to have an agreement not to actually do intelligence gathering with other countries. But at the same time, that doesn't forgive the fact that we need to harden our targets as much as possible. And when that happens, we don't have to like it either. We can do things in response to it.
Well, I know in 2015, the maybe one thing that there was a meeting, I think that was the only thing I saw take place, but between the United States and China agreed to refrain from conducting or supporting cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, including trade secrets and other confidential business information. I think I know the answer to this question, but is China abiding with that agreement currently?
I think to some extent the jury's out. I think a lot of the people who track this in the private sector said there was a large diminution in that kind of activity. It doesn't mean that intrusions from China stop by any means. It means that kind of commercial espionage to benefit their commercial sector, which is something we don't do, we don't think any country should do, and they agreed not to do, diminished substantially. Now, there have been mixed reports recently about that. I think if there is a breach of that agreement, we have to take it seriously, and we have to make sure there are consequences for that. But I think it did at least have an effect. And it was then enshrined in the G20 statement and with other countries around the world. So there was pressure not just from us, but from other countries too, because they were also victims of this.
Like in any agreement, if there, I mean, what are the penalties for violating that agreement?
Yeah, I mean, the penalties, like I said, nothing was taken off the table. We didn't say, hey, if you agree to this, we're not going to sanction you. We didn't give anything for that, right? So those are all still on the table. If we see that happening, the government can use sanctions. The government can use other law enforcement actions like they have before against the PLA officers. There's still a range of things that the U.S. can do and the U.S. and its allies can do in appropriate circumstances, and you want to make sure you have the right factual basis to do that.
I
would submit, however, as I said before, I think our tool set's still too slim. I think we need to develop other tools to respond to these kinds of threats in cyberspace.
Do you agree that if a NATO country was attacked in an act of cyber warfare, that Article 5 would apply and be invoked?
I absolutely do. In fact, NATO said that was the fact. I mean, Article 5 is a fact specific, it's a case-by-case basis. It's been invoked once, 9/11. But I think if it's a sufficient attack that causes the same kind of death and injury that a physical one did, absolutely it could be involved on a case-by-case basis.
The Russian interference in our elections. Congress passed sanctions on Russia for that. Were there any other consequences taken by the administration for that? And I got briefed by Jay Johnson and D&I Clapper during the previous administration on that in around October before the elections occurred. It was clear to me it was happening. The attribution was clear. I didn't see, my advice was to call it out for what it was and that there should be consequences to bad behavior like that.
I would agree that the consequences were imposed, and there were a number of them in December at the end of the administration. There were some economic sanctions. There were throwing a number of diplomats out of the country and closing compounds. There were a number of things done. But for deterrence to actually work, it has to be timely, and 6 months later is a long time. And that has to continue because the threat's still there. So we didn't really, I think the cyber community didn't really understand the nature of this threat. We knew about attacks against infrastructures. We knew about potential theft of intellectual property. We weren't focused on this hybrid threat when it happened.
Well, I'll be working, my committee, Homeland, DHS will be, as we go into 2018 elections, there's no question that they're going to try to do this again.
Yes.
In fact, there's some evidence they're already interfering in some U.S. Senate races. And, well, that's a good question for all three. What role do you think the federal government could play in the 2018 elections?
So, the things I've laid out, and I'm not the only one, Rick Leggett and others have talked about this in the past, a strong, clear declaratory statement that this is unacceptable and we'll take action. Really a task force that's an interagency task force to work on this and also to deal with other parties, and particularly social media and others. working as has been happened, but working with the state and local election officials to actually secure their systems. I know DHS is doing some of that, but really up our game substantially there. Having the willingness to use tools to deter this action and actually having more tools there. I mean, that's just part of the response. And then, frankly, working with other countries. Other countries are facing the same problem, not in 2018 elections, but in elections that they have. And maybe looking at some of the things they've done to push back against this and try to go after these disinformation campaigns. The one thing I'd say is this is not just a cyber problem, right? This has to be a hybrid solution to a hybrid threat. We have to have other players in the room and not just the cyber people.
Yeah. Well, I was in France right before Macron's election. I don't think the French bought into the propaganda. I was in Estonia and Ukraine. I mean, talk about a laboratory for malicious behavior. And I think we're learning a lot from that experience.
And I should mention that, as we stated, Michael Sahlmeyer has been working in the Belfer incident, has been working on some of these issues too. So I don't know if you want to address these quickly. I've taken all the time.
I mean, my time has expired, but I guess I'm in the chair, so.
Thank you for the opportunity to plug the Belfer Center, Chris. That's why we've devoted work over the last year to trying to help state and local officials and also campaigns just protect themselves and be harder to hack in the absence of federal government doing a lot over the last year. So what I would like to see, I'd like to see in terms of collection priorities, threats to the election be at the top. I don't know where they are, I'm not in. But then I'd like to make sure that there's a willingness to neuter attackers before they strike abroad. And then I'd like to be able to see the willingness to reduce classification or declassify information that should get into the hands of those who can use it, make it actionable, and defend themselves.
That's very good. Just let me just say in closing that, first of all, Chris, you did a fantastic job at State as the coordinator for cyber. Since, I guess, 2011 is when that was created. Secretary Tillerson then tried to merge that office with the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. And they said it was an interim step. But in my judgment, as I try to create a cyber agency within DHS, it almost appeared as if it was not a priority if you're merging it with another office like that. I would like to see a cyber office that makes it a priority, and I think that's what the Cyber Diplomacy Act that I worked with the chairman on to codify the Office of Cyber Issues, led by a Senate-confirmed ambassador, precisely what we're trying to do here, is elevate the priority and the mission within the State Department. Do all three of you agree with this, this bill?
I completely agree with this. I think the bill's formulation is absolutely correct. I know the State Department just today sent a letter saying they were going to create a bureau dealing with some of these issues, which is great. However, the way its reporting structure is through the economic undersecretary, which, given the breadth of these issues and the security issues, doesn't make a lot of sense. I think the bill's statement that it should be through the political undersecretary or higher makes a lot more sense as a cross-cutting issue. But I think that bill, frankly, helped motivate some of these changes, and that's good. And we need to really keep the pressure on.
That's good. Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Chairman McCall, for now anyway. Right. Yeah, I also, and we, ITI, agree with the stated objectives of the Cyber Diplomacy Act. You know, and those probably don't need any repeating here, but also the proposed follow-through on actually how you're going to keep the internet open and free while also protecting security and promoting data flows. You know, one of the things that's really important about that is, number one, having a State Department cyber coordinator's office that really is focused on the cyber issues. And we've heard that here today, but then also the bill suggests the necessary follow-through. I mean, as Mr. Painter mentioned earlier, there was a lot of good progress made both bilaterally and multilaterally, in recent years by State. But you need to hold the counterparties accountable for the agreements that they're signing, and we really need to keep furthering these types of approaches because these issues are not getting easier; they're getting harder, and we need to be working together on this with our allies.
I agree completely. Dr. Sahlmeyer?
Same answer, but different reason. if I might offer, which is that from an interagency or non-State Department perspective, having a dedicated office like Chris Painter ran gives you the touch point. You know who to call when you're at DOD or you're at a different part of the government. And that's how policymaking works, is not always at the secretary level, but also at the lower levels of the bureaucracy. So I'm a big supporter of this for additional reasons, because it helps the rest of the government come together and play as a team.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a point of contact, I think, for other departments. We have closing. Okay. Well, anyway, I want to thank all of you for your testimony and your expertise and leadership on this very important issue. I think it's often overlooked as some sort of technical in the ether type thing, but in reality, it's very real, and it is a threat on many levels. So I appreciate your leadership on this issue. And with that, the committee now stands adjourned.